But the tribes of the East are now seen as potential allies. Though each side will use propaganda criticizing the other for employing savages in battle, both North and South offer Native Americans higher and higher bounties to sign up.
The Indians know they will get a $50 federal bounty, they will get a $25 state bounty, and that they will be paid $13 a month like every regular soldier in the regiment. The money was a big incentive.
Other promises are made or implied. There may be rewards and recognition after the war, if they join the winning side.
Some, like the Cherokees, saw the advantages of joining the Confederacy based on the fact that the Confederacy offered a position within the Confederate Congress in Richmond, the idea that they could be spokespersons in the Confederate Congress.
Many Native Americans decided to join the Union Army to save the lands that they still possessed in the North. And they figured if they joined the Army, they would then have a stake in their country, and their country would recognize that.
At least 20,000 Native Americans respond to these overtures, though some estimates put the number closer to 30,000. It is difficult today to single out Native Americans on the surviving roster lists. Many who joined were already assimilated, at least in part to white traditions, and had taken Christian names.
Like the Williamses, the Joneses, you see, the Lyons, Parker, names like that are everyday English, including French names. These would be the names that they take.
But there is no question they are there, fighting for the North, integrated among both white and colored troops, and for the South under both white and Native American commanders. Though they were often less well equipped than their white counterparts and doubtless faced the discrimination common in the day. The letters and diaries that survive reveal that many of the white enlisted men came to view the Native American recruits with respect.
One of the white sharpshooters put out a small book at the end of the war, and he listed the Indians in Company K. And he said, here we had a group of men who could scarcely call this their own country, and they fought for it nonetheless.
Many would fight with everything they had, not just for the Union or the Confederacy, but for their own very personal reasons.
There was a blood feud out here for many, many years.
June 23rd, 1865. Nearly 3 months have passed since the fall of Petersburg, when the last of the Virginia blockades was broken and the Confederate capital in Richmond was finally breached. It has been more than 2 months since the commanders of the two weary armies met to sign the terms of surrender at the nearby outpost of Appomattox. But for some, the war is not yet over. One last act has yet to be played out. At a prearranged spot not far from Fort Towson, in what is now Oklahoma, an aging man in battle-worn clothes appears. He is Stand Watie, a brilliant Cherokee leader and tactician, the highest-ranking Native American in the Confederate Army, and the last Confederate general to surrender. He will do so under his own terms. The path that led him to this moment began not with the rift between North and South, but with a fracture within his own people. The breaking point came 3 decades before over a policy by the American government known as Indian removal.
It would be as though someone would simply show up at your home and say, we're going to take you 2,000 miles away and leave everything that you know and everything you are familiar with behind.
The destination the government set aside for this purpose was called Indian Territory, some 70,000 square miles bordered by Texas on the south and Kansas on the north, comprising most of what is now Oklahoma. Here, the government built a series of forts largely to keep peace among the tribes forced to live in close proximity.
The government, I expect, thought that one Indian could get along with the next Indian. But it would be like somebody putting somebody in your house and saying you're going to share this house with them, and they're surprised when there's fighting. Who's going to get the master bedroom? Who's going to get the shower? You know, those kind of things.
In the Civil War to come, the Indian Territory will be used as a buffer zone between North and South. But from the start, there are conflicts within its borders that will erupt once again with the coming of the war. some of the bloodiest were between members of the same tribe, the Cherokees of southeastern Tennessee and northern Georgia.
As a Cherokee citizen, I can speak very pointedly to the Cherokee removal. It meant internal division. It meant civil war inside of the Cherokee Nation.
In 1835, faced with growing pressure for removal, the Cherokees split into two groups, factions which will impact the outcome of the Civil War some 3 decades later. One side, headed by John Ross, the principal chief of the Cherokee, refused to relocate. But the other half of the tribe believed that, with whites already encroaching on their lands in the south, relocation was inevitable. In December, some 20 leaders, including the family of Stand Watie, signed a treaty agreeing to move to the Indian Territory.
I like to believe that they understood that the only way the Cherokee Nation would survive would be in a totally different environment, and that would be beyond the Mississippi.
Chief Ross and his followers are left behind until the Army forces them to make the move at gunpoint. A 1,000-mile march that will come to be known as the Trail of Tears. When Ross, whose wife died along with 4,000 Cherokees on the trail, finally arrived in Indian Territory, the stage is set for revenge against those who signed the treaty.
These are names that were marked for death. If I have brought my family on the Trail of Tears and I have lost loved ones and I have lost my ancestral homelands, then I now can identify those that have caused that to happen, and I am now prepared to re-evoke a millennia-old tradition of the Cherokee people called the Blood Law.
Among those marked for assassination under the Blood Law were Stand Watie and his relatives. On June 22, 1839, 3 of his family members were killed: his brother, uncle, and a cousin.
Stand Watie would have been in that group as well, if not having been warned and escaping from his home area to go into seclusion for days.
It was then that Watie gathered supporters of the treaty together and led a series of attacks against the Ross Party.
Those that signed were assassinated by those that didn't sign. And then those that were assassinated then took reprisals.
That tipped off a back and forth murder environment in the Cherokee Nation that went on for years. It was Bloods and Crips, and it was murder elevated to an art form.
In 1846, the U.S. took steps to halt the violence. Under the watch of peacekeeping troops in nearby Fort Gibson, the two factions were compelled to bury the hatchet. John Ross's status as principal chief was affirmed, and the Cherokees were once again one nation, but only on the surface. The Civil War will split the old wound wide open. Before the first shots are fired, when the southern states are still announcing their succession, there is pressure on the Cherokee to choose sides.
Both sides considered Indian Territory a buffer zone, Kansas to the north and Texas to the south. But it was more important to the Confederacy because they thought they would be vulnerable for an attack through Indian Territory, which is why they aggressively recruited Native Americans to fight there.
Confederate recruiters promised the Cherokee a place within the Confederate Congress and a way to continue a lifestyle that is, in many ways, Southern.
Many of the Cherokees had plantations just like you'd find in Mississippi or Alabama. They were wearing their hair long and curled at the end and were wearing gentlemen's finery. They were living the life as Southerners, many of them Southern planters, with slaves.
Slaves here in the Indian Territory had a little bit more freedom than they necessarily would in the South. They were able to carry weapons. They were able to deal with cash. They were allowed to live in their own quarters. So it wasn't exactly freedom out here, so don't get me wrong at that. It was definitely slavery, but it was a little bit more relaxed than in the general South.
The Union, by contrast, seems to give up on the Indian Territory.
At the onset of the war, Union soldiers were taken from the west. Most of the forts were closed up, and they were sent east, basically to guard Washington, D.C.
The Union troops were basically sent eastward from April and May of 1861 and were to abandon Indian Territory to Confederate forces.
The move leaves John Ross, who has long enjoyed the support of the federal government, in a vulnerable position. A vulnerability that Stand Watie is quick to exploit.
Stand Watie, for example, he gathered up a bunch of troops to support the Confederacy even before the Confederacy had a president. So the political lines were drawn on the old treaties.
Watie, I believe, saw the Civil War as an opportunity to set the record straight, and not so much by putting the hatchet in those that had killed his uncle and his cousins and his brother and had attempted on his life, but to set the record straight by handing the power of the government over to a group of individuals that had and was responsible for setting the course of the Cherokee people.
When the Confederates offer Watie a commandership, he eagerly accepts. The Indian Territories are about to be torn by a civil war within a civil war.
There was a vendetta that was right under the surface, and Stand Watie, to some degree, saw his chance during the Civil War to take back the Cherokee Nation.
It is the summer of 1862. The Union forces that had pulled out of Indian Territory a year before return in force. They fight their way back over the Kansas border and retake Fort Gibson. This so-called buffer zone, the no man's land between the forces of the North and the South, is too important to abandon to the Confederacy.
It's really a gateway to get to Arkansas and then to the Mississippi and then ultimately to New Orleans, not to mention your way down to Texas. So they really saw it as a key element to preserving the West. The Union was worried about losing Missouri. They saw if they lost Missouri, then the whole Western theater would fall.
3 days after they retake Fort Gibson, the Union soldiers are approached by John Ross, official leader of the Cherokee, though actually he represents only a faction. The other half of the tribe, led by his longtime rival Stand Watie, has already joined the Confederacy.
A lot of the Civil War in Indian Territory had more to do with the old blood feud vendettas than it did with national issues. It's really more along political lines than it is anything else.
The Union sends Ross to Fort Scott, Kansas for protection. He eventually makes his way to Washington, where he spends the rest of the war pleading the Cherokee cause to the government.
He went to Washington and lobbied for the Cherokees, saying that not all the Cherokees were bad, that many of them supported the Union and were fighting for the Union.
But Stand Watie is doing much to refute those claims. He becomes known as the territory's most formidable guerrilla fighter.
His specialty was truly keeping a mounted rifle unit. It's really kind of an 1840s terminology in the Army used to describe what we today would term as a Green Beret unit. These were highly mobile individuals with a wide variety of skills that could live off of the land, and they could hit very hard and totally dissipate into the countryside.
Early on, Watie participates in several regimented battles in and around Indian Territory. Most notably the Battle of Wilson's Creek in 1861, after which he is made a colonel in the Confederate Army. But he soon decides that conventional warfare is not for him.
In the beginning of the war, Stand Watie is almost captured twice, at Cowskin Prairie and then again at Fort Wayne. And he learned from that very quickly that he didn't want to do a set piece with the Union because they were generally better equipped and better trained. And that's do a set piece battle, Napoleonic style.
In 1862, when the Union Army returns to Indian Territory, Watie finds a more suitable target.
Stand Watie saw to it that not only Fort Gibson was being harassed after its reoccupation by federal troops, but their supply lines coming out of Fort Scott, Kansas were under constant harassment or seizure by Stand Watie and his men.
Any Union soldier who leaves the safety of the fort risks a deadly encounter.
He became a hit-and-run artist, and he was very good at it.
That success is reflected in the unorthodox appearance of his men.
Wade's boys are accused many times of being dressed as Federals. The Confederacy wasn't able to send them uniforms or equipment or ammunition or food. So the only place that the Confederates, if they wanted to keep themselves fed, clothed, and supplied with ammunition, was to take it from the Union.
Supplies of any kind are scarce in Indian Territory. In the course of the war, nearly every settlement is put to the torch. More than 90 battles will be fought in its streets and fields as the Confederates use it to draw in and bog down more and more Union troops.
To a large extent, it was a way to divert Union attention from the Eastern Front. And that was one of the centers of the strategy of the Confederacy.
Each time a major Confederate campaign is launched in the East, Stand Watie redoubles his attacks along the Kansas border, drawing Union soldiers away from where they are needed most. The frustrated Federal troops make Watie their primary target, as his daring raids capture the imagination of the public and the press, which dubs him the Red Fox.
They called Stand Watie the Red Fox because he was slippery and hard to catch. And he'd appear when you would least expect him to, getting your chickens out of the chicken coop, so to speak.
But Watie's greatest fame comes near the end of the war, shortly after his promotion to Brigadier General. In the summer of 1864, Watie learns from a prisoner of war that a Union wagon train bearing $1 million worth of supplies is about to leave Fort Scott for Fort Gibson.
They're supplying about 3,000 troops and about 9,000 refugees. So that's a lot of food supplies, tentage, clothing that all has to come down in here. 300 wagons pulled by 4 up mules, so it was huge.
Watie knows the route they will take. He confers with one of his white counterparts, a Texas brigadier general named Richard Gannot, and outlines a daring plan of attack. On September 18th, the two generals gather some 2,000 troops, half white, half Cherokee, on the high bluffs around Cabin Creek. As darkness falls, they approach the spot where the wagon train, guarded by about 460 well-armed Federal troops, has camped for the night.
Troops are bedded down for the most part. You know, they got their boots off, they got their shoes off, their rifles are stacked. They're either in their tents or laying out on the stars, and they're asleep. Mules are quietly grazing.
Under cover of darkness, Watie's men ford the creek and approach from the west. Gannot's men close in from the east. The creek itself becomes their third flank. Their first target, however, is not the sleeping men, but the mules tethered a short distance away.
And the next thing you know, there's cannon fire.
The mules stampede, taking with them the only chance the Union has to move their wagons out of the line of fire.
Now you're waking up out of a dead sleep to cannon fire, first of all. Then you're trying to get your shoes on, you're trying to find a rifle, and mules are running through, just kicking and going crazy. It's at night, you're disoriented, you have no idea of where to set a line of battle. You have no idea where the enemy is coming from.
In the confusion, the Federal troops break and run.
So the Union never could really put up a good defense. And then the Confederates just swooped down on top of them.
With more than 160 Federal troops killed or wounded and only 45 Confederate dead, Watie and Gannot load up what they can and burn the rest of the supply train.
There's some 300 wagons, hundreds of mules and livestock were taken in that raid, and in each of those wagons badly needed food, clothing, armament, powder, all of the munitions and supplies needed to continue the war.
The generals managed to elude the reinforcements sent from Fort Gibson and escape with their prize. The high-profile victory unnerves the Union and boosts Confederate morale. The South seems poised to take back Indian Territory and push northward, but it is not to be. In the East, the Union General William Tecumseh Sherman has reached Atlanta. The tide is about to turn.
Unfortunately, as big as that victory was, and it was lauded all the way to Jefferson Davis' office, still it was too little too late for the Confederacy and the Cherokee Nation.
The Confederate forces are destined to be drawn away from their successes in the Indian Territory. Another conflict, unfolding hundreds of miles away, is about to change the momentum of the war. Deep in the swamps of the South, another warrior readies for battle. Like Stand Watie, his is not a fight of ideology or of the issues of succession or slavery, but a war of personal retribution and revenge.